Hello everyone, my name is John Lennon. I want to thank you for giving me the time to present my project. The title of my presentation is Low Socioeconomic Status and Disaster Preparedness: How Low Socioeconomic Status Families Are Disproportionately at Risk During Disasters. So what is the problem? The problem that we will be discussing is that people with a low socioeconomic status have been shown to have a higher risk of physical harm and economic losses before, during, and after a disaster. That's compared to people of a medium to high socioeconomic status. Research shows that people of a lower bracket feel the effects of a disaster at a much larger scale. Um, this can be caused by a number of different reasons, and it is important to research this topic because it can help reduce the vulnerabilities that many Americans have. So why is this research important? The more research done on this topic, the more organizations and elected officials will be able to gauge the disaster response and mitigation landscape. This information can make it easier to prescribe certain policies that keep the low socioeconomic status communities at a lower risk, because the risk disparity can be an issue in many places, as we will get into. The figure on the left shows almost a $500 billion loss in the year 2017, and these losses have a disproportionately greater effect on poor people. Although the chart does not directly translate to low SES vulnerabilities, the same losses disproportionately affect someone of a low socioeconomic status because their livelihoods depend on fewer assets, their consumption is closer to subsistence levels, and they can't rely on savings to smooth the impacts of a disaster. Wealthier people are not as affected by the losses examined in this chart, which is why it's important to look at traditional disaster losses, even to examine low SES vulnerabilities. And I think in the future there should be a lot more research done on the actual effects of specifically low socioeconomic status families. Um, Another report also found that poor people are more likely to have their savings concentrated in their homes, which can obviously be damaged or lost due to a disaster. While people who are not poor are more likely to have their savings in various places, such as financial institutions. Um, so that means wealthier people's savings are more likely to be protected during a disaster. Disasters push over 26 million people around the world into poverty each year, and a lack of savings to protect against the financial hardships that come with a disaster is one reason why many survivors are disproportionately affected by disasters. Um, if an individual is not prepared financially for the increased costs that come with living after a disaster, they will be in a bad spot both financially and possibly, mentally. So the social vulnerability of people with a low socioeconomic status. First, there are many studies done that show that low income leads to a greater likelihood of living in a fragile home that is more vulnerable to a disaster. A study by Fothergill and Peak has reported that people with low income are less likely to be prepared for a disaster, which may relate to the fact that preparedness actions are costly. Some examples of this are not purchasing flood insurance or not strengthening the defenses of your house from a disaster. A study from Money Pulse has shown that only 30% of Americans have savings to pay for a $500 to $1,000 emergency. Also, many Americans with a lower SES can be put at risk due to the inability to purchase a vehicle, which can make evacuation much harder. So families and communities with a high social vulnerability are more likely to be adversely affected by disasters and result in a higher level of human and economic loss. So here we see the social factors that come with socioeconomic status: being below the poverty line, being unemployed, having low income, and also having no high school diploma are all factors that tie into being in a low socioeconomic status. And as we could see, that increases the overall vulnerability of that group. Also, we could see the housing and transportation. Usually, people of a lower socioeconomic status are housed in these types of multi-unit structures, mobile homes. Um, and as we said before, people with a lower socioeconomic status are less likely to have things such as vehicles, which can affect vulnerability. So how does low socioeconomic status lead to an increased risk before, during, and after a disaster? So before a disaster, um, people tend to be less prepared. This is due to many factors, such as not having the proper funds to purchase disaster preparedness tools, such as flood insurance. Um, People of a low socioeconomic status were also found to be less likely to evacuate for reasons such as having no form of transportation. And research also shows that low socioeconomic status relates to being less likely to receive warning messages and also less likely to understand them. And this may be due to a number of reasons, such as poor education or lack of outreach from local government. During a disaster, people of a low socioeconomic status are more at risk because they're more likely to live in fragile housing. A study from the World Bank found that people of poverty are more likely to live in a high-risk disaster area, and also people of a low SES were found to be more likely to have savings concentrated in their homes, which can be destroyed during a disaster. After disasters, people in low socioeconomic status communities were shown to be less likely to receive proper aid and have limited access to public and private recovery assets. For example, after Hurricane Irene, areas characterized by low socioeconomic status were shown to lack shopping options for groceries and basic needs. So an increased education for disaster response groups on the social vulnerability of specific populations, especially those with a low SES, I think can be very beneficial. Um, Also, providing evacuation aid prior to disasters targeted specifically towards low socioeconomic status groups could drastically change the vulnerabilities that low socioeconomic status communities have in times of disaster. Um, Also, implementing effective and fair allocation of resources by government officials and elected leaders is something that could be very beneficial. Suggesting local government and community members with a high knowledge of the local community are given significant roles in the evacuation and implementation aspects of disaster mitigation can help. Uh, Also, developing policies and backing policies that promote the construction and maintenance of affordable housing in a way that's safe for people to live in, especially for people that are living in high risk areas. So since people of a low socioeconomic status are less likely to receive, understand, and believe warning messages from state and local governments, is why community outreach programs that specifically target areas that house low socioeconomic status families and individuals can be very beneficial. It can have a significant impact on disaster vulnerability. I think people that are more able to receive and properly evaluate warning messages from their state and local governments will most likely be less vulnerable to a disaster. Um, Increased access to post-disaster financial aid is something that can be very beneficial not only to low socioeconomic status families, but also people in the middle class, because it's found that disasters actually make many people in that middle range impoverished. So this is something that can be implemented anywhere. So thank you everyone for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I hope the rest of the showcase goes well. Thank you.